The wind on Gliese 667cc never stopped. It howled like a wounded animal through the jagged ice canyons, carrying with it temperatures that could shatter exposed steel within minutes. The planet was a frozen ball of death, orbiting too far from its dim red sun to support any known life comfortably. Not that anyone expected comfort. Least of all the aliens who'd first charted it. Commander Wenton Hale stepped out of the lander and immediately felt the bite of the wind through his thermosuit. He adjusted the seal at the collar and tapped on the side of his helmet. Readings confirm ambient temperature at -112 Celsius. He set into his comm, visibility under 200 meters. Ice density off the charts. Oxygen negligible. Behind him, the rest of the expedition team disembarked, their boots crunching against the frost-hardened surface. Overhead, the alien vessel hovered silently, sleek, seamless, indifferent. The alien who had brought them here stood at the edge of the landing zone, its skin a dull blue that shimmered faintly in the planet's weak sunlight. It didn't seem to feel the cold. It had no name that humans could pronounce, but Wenton called it Solen. "You will not last long," Solen said, its voice like gravel dropped in water. "Your kind cannot survive in this environment. We offered you a different colony site." "We didn't come here for comfort," Wenton replied. "We came to prove we can make it anywhere." Solen tilted its head. "Adaptation is not obstinacy. This is a graveyard. Even our kind avoid it." Wenton looked over the icy horizon, then back at the dull gray crates being unloaded from the lander. "We'll see about that." The first challenge wasn't the cold. It was the time. They had only 60 hours before the lander's internal heating systems failed for good. That meant building the first shelter fast before the wind stripped their flesh or the ice cracked beneath their feet. "Oriana, start unpacking the fusion bore," Wenton ordered. "We need a cavity in the ice, something deep and shielded." Oriana Pike, the team's structural engineer, yanked the tarp off a crate and began assembling the bore with practiced speed. "You want a cavity? You'll get a cathedral," she said, teeth chattering. Power cables snaked across the ice as the bore powered up. Within an hour, it began to chew through the glacial surface, sending up clouds of steam and sharp hissing sounds as vapor met frozen air. Solen watched silently from a ridge. It hadn't moved since the landing. On the second day, the bore struck a pocket of methane ice, and the resulting explosion killed technician Everett Malls instantly. It also collapsed part of the bore tunnel, trapping Oriana's left leg under a slab of fractured ice. Wenton and 2 crew members dug her out with bare hands, despite the risk of frostbite. Her leg was badly swollen and she couldn't stand. "Get a scan on that leg," Wenton said, breathing hard. "Now." The med unit confirmed a fracture in the fibula and bruising along the tibia. "How long until she can walk?" Wenton asked. 6 weeks minimum," replied the medic, "even with bone mesh and stim injections. Then she stays in the shelter. We move forward without her." Oriana grabbed Wenton's sleeve. "You need me. I can work on the designs from inside. Just get me a screen and a heat source." Wenton nodded. "You'll have both." By day 5, they had a tunnel 30 meters deep and a primary chamber large enough to house 6 people. They installed insulation panels and heat coils powered by a compact fusion core. The temperature inside hovered just above freezing, but to them it felt like spring. Solen descended into the chamber uninvited. It examined the walls, tapped on the support braces, and stared at the humans as they huddled around a heat emitter. "You persist," it said. "But this is not thriving. This is flailing." Wenton handed it a thermal sensor. "Check the numbers." "We're not just surviving. We're engineering." The alien stared at the display for a long moment. "You build a shell in a storm and call it progress," Solen said. "But you ignore the deeper truth: this planet does not want you here." Wenton stood. "No planet wants anything. It's just a place. We give it meaning by being here." In the following days, they expanded. Using thermal drills and structural foam, they carved tunnels and chambers, reinforcing them with alloy beams and icecrete, a frozen blend of water and polymer dust. They built airlocks, hydroponic beds, and a central command post. More supply drops came from orbit. Each time, Solen returned to watch. "Why do you keep coming back?" Oriana asked one evening, her leg in a brace but her hands typing away on a console. "To witness the failure," Solen replied. "But it has not yet come." By the 3rd week, Wenton's fingers were blackened with frostbite from a failed airlock seal test. The med team amputated the tips of 3 fingers. He didn't protest. He just learned to type differently and kept working. Storms battered the surface, winds climbing to 200 kilometers per hour. Temperatures dropped further. The exterior systems froze solid, but inside the icy shelter, the humans adapted. They learned to grow moss strains under LED lights, recycled every drop of water, and used body heat to warm small compartments during blackouts. Then the quakes began. On day 38, a tremor cracked the central corridor, causing a partial collapse. Engineer Ralvin broke 2 ribs and suffered a concussion. Wenton called for a seismic scan. The glacier's shifting, Oriana said, staring at the monitor. We built on a moving fault line. How long do we have? Wenton asked. Maybe a week before a full collapse. Wenton turned to the others. We move. We find a stable shelf and rebuild. The team stared at him. We just finished this place, someone muttered. And if we stay, we die in it. He pointed to the surface map. There's a ridge 6 kilometers northeast. Higher ground. Better structure. The march through the storm took 12 hours. They lost 2 drones to the wind. The snow was waist deep, and 1 crew member suffered hypothermia and had to be carried the last kilometer. Solen followed them silently, offering no help, just observing. The ridge was everything Wenton hoped: solid ice mixed with volcanic rock. The new shelter took less time to establish. They replicated the old design, improved it, and added a geothermal tap that provided more stable power. By day 60, they weren't just surviving, they were living. The greenhouse chamber had its first sprigs of edible kelp. The hydro recyclers were producing clean water. Oriana was walking again, slowly, with a crutch. Solen entered the new shelter and stayed longer this time. It looked at the walls, the warmth, the food. You were supposed to freeze, it said. Wenton slid a panel closed behind him. We were supposed to learn. And we did. Solen touched the wall, its hand lingering on the warmth radiating from within. You came to die, and instead you made a home. We didn't come to die, Wenton said. We came to see if we could make it. That's what we do. Solen was quiet for a long time. Then it turned and left without another word. Outside, the wind screamed on. Inside, humans planted seeds in trays of nutrient gel, repaired gear, and charted more of the icy world one step at a time. 3 days after the move to the ridge, Wenton woke to a sharp, metallic rattling from the north corridor. He rolled upright, reaching for the utility light clipped to the wall. The temperature inside was stable, but the air smelled faintly of scorched polymer. Power flux again, muttered Oriana from the adjacent bunk, already pulling on her boots. Wenton followed her through the low passageway, ducking beneath the exposed heat exchangers. The rattling grew louder as they neared the geothermal tap housing. Inside, Morgan was already knee-deep in the access trench, sparks dancing from her welding torch. Fault in the secondary transfer coil, she said without looking up. It's arcing against the frame. If it spreads to the primary, we'll lose junction integrity. Wenton dropped to a crouch beside her. We've got spare sheathing? Enough for a patch. Not a full replacement. Do the patch. Then reroute the load to the west array until we can fabricate more. Morgan nodded, sweat gleaming at her temples. Despite the cold, the tap chamber was stifling. By the time they returned to the common room, the lights had dimmed to conserve power. Ralvin was propped awkwardly against the wall, his ribs taped and a diagnostic pad balanced on one knee. I'm picking up strange shifts under chamber 3, he said, not glancing up. Compressive, not torsional. Could be a glacier vein swelling. Seal the lower access, said Wenton. If pressure builds, we don't want to burst under our feet. Across the room, Oriana muttered something about needing better seismic mapping. Wenton thumbed through the surface logs. The last drone flight hadn't returned. It was nearly 100 hours later when Solen reappeared unannounced as always. This time it didn't enter the shelter. It stood at the periphery of the geothermal vent, head tilted toward the steam rising in languid curls. I thought your kind avoided geothermal activity, Wenton said, approaching with a thermal scanner slung over one shoulder. This vent is old, replied Solen. Its violence has passed. I came to understand why you remain. You've seen why. We're not looking for approval. You reject optimality, said Solen. There are other planets, more temperate, more welcoming. There are also deserts on Earth. Cities in the Arctic. We never needed welcoming. Solen reached down and pressed 3 fingers into the snow. Your survival is not accidental, but it is still irrational. Wenton crouched, brushing frost from a pressure release gauge. It's only irrational if success requires comfort. That same evening, Morgan collapsed during a pressure seal inspection. She'd been working 14-hour shifts since the quake, and the med readout showed electrolyte imbalance and early-stage renal stress. She's been drinking recycled coolant again, Oriana said flatly, watching the intravenous drip stabilize Morgan's vitals. We warned her. She said it's fresher than the tea, muttered Ralvin. No more unfiltered fluids, period, Wenton said. We rotate hydration packs, even if they taste like algae. 2 days later, with Morgan recovering and the power grid stable, Wenton authorized the first long-range drone survey since they relocated. The flight path would arc westward over a ravine system untouched by the initial scans. The drone launched at dawn, its relay signal strong and steady. By midday, it had mapped a 20-kilometer stretch and discovered a narrow crevasse lined with metallic minerals. The readings hinted at high concentrations of molybdenum and vanadium, both rare, both invaluable. Oriana was already sketching modular extraction rigs before the drone even returned. Solen appeared that evening, waiting outside the comms module with its head tilted toward the setting sun or what passed for it on Gliese 667cc. You seek resources now, it observed. Not merely survival. Wenton nodded. We don't waste potential. If this planet has something to offer, we'll find a use for it. There is no trade route here. No civilization to exchange with. We're not here to sell. We're here to build. Solen's gaze lingered on the reinforced dome overhead. You build with no audience but yourselves. That is rare. You'd be surprised, said Oriana from behind them. Humans spent centuries building cathedrals in places no one lived just because they could. Solen looked at her. And you. I design structures that don't fall on people's heads. And I like challenges. The alien's skin shimmered faintly, the closest thing Wenton had ever seen to amusement from it. The next morning, the ice cracked open beneath the western perimeter. No warning tremors, no seismic rumbles, just a sudden, thunderous fracture that swallowed one of the solar pylons whole. Wenton hit the emergency klaxon. Evacuate West Sector. Now. By the time they reached the breach, a chasm nearly 8 meters across had split the plateau. The edge sheared clean through the pylon base, cutting power to the auxiliary grid. Thermal stress from the inner vein, said Ralvin, scanning the edge. It shifted under us again. Any casualties? Wenton asked. No one was out there. The warning net held. Oriana paced the edge, teeth clenched. We'll need to anchor the new pylons into bedrock. I'll design a bracing array using the vanadium composite. It'll hold. Use whatever you need, said Wenton. We're not moving again. That night, the interior humidity dropped sharply. Ice crystals formed in the sleeping quarters. The fusion coils had tripped a failsafe in response to the power loss. Wenton rewired the backup capacitors manually, his fingers still healing from frostbite. He didn't speak, didn't ask for assistance. Oriana found him slumped against the panel an hour later, the tip of one knuckle split open again. She didn't scold him, just handed him gauze and sat beside him until he finished. By the end of the week, the new pylons were operational, the structural braces locked into the underlying basalt. The team installed seismic monitors along the trench edges, each set to trigger evacuation protocols if movement was detected. The mineral samples from the crevasse were confirmed. High-grade molybdenum, nearly pure. Enough to reinforce every structural element in the entire shelter, and then some. We don't have the equipment to process it properly, said Morgan, back on her feet and chewing a protein wafer. But with a microfoundry, we could start fabrication. We'll request a drop, said Wenton. Tell the orbital relay to prep a descent pod. Solen entered the habitat unannounced for the first time, stepping over the threshold without hesitation. You are changing the land, it said, glancing at the mineral cores stacked along the wall. We change everything we touch, said Wenton. Sometimes for better. Sometimes not. Most species adapt to avoid extinction. You adapt to expand. We don't just endure. We persist. Oriana stood, brushing dust from her sleeves. And if something breaks, we rebuild it stronger. Solen ran a hand across the mineral core. There is no record of your kind doing this before. Not here. Not on any world this hostile. Good, said Wenton. Means we're just getting started. The alien looked around at the narrow corridors, the humming vents, the faint green glow of the hydroponic trays. You do not survive by accident, it said again quietly. No, Wenton replied. We survive because we refuse not to. At first light on day 83, the air inside the habitat had a strange metallic tang. Wenton noticed it when brushing his teeth, a faint iron note that clung to the inside of his mouth even after rinsing. Oriana confirmed it in the atmospheric monitor logs. Trace metal particulates had spiked during the night, likely drawn in by a microfracture in the intake system. Morgan climbed the intake shaft by hand using a rigged harness and a headlamp. The breach was barely the width of a wrist, but enough to have let in glacial dust saturated with oxidized compounds. Looks like the outer seal warped during the last thermal cycle, she said, voice echoing down the shaft. It's not cracked. It's bent. Like something pushed from the inside. Pressure inversion? Wenton leaned into the hatchway, squinting up toward her. Morgan shook her head. No. Something shifted underneath. The whole shaft's leaning 2 degrees west. This ice doesn't move unless something big is stirring. They sealed the breach with a composite patch and triple-layer membrane, then flushed the ductwork with ionized air. The metallic taste faded by the next morning, but the incident triggered a broader inspection. By day 85, Oriana had mapped stress gradients across the entire glacier shelf. The data showed something peculiar. A consistent pattern of subsurface heat pockets moving eastward. The geothermal field wasn't static. It was migrating. These aren't natural shifts, she said, tracing the arcs on the display. They're too regular. Something is causing convection plumes under the ice. Possibly volcanic, but nothing matches expected tectonic models. Wenton studied the readouts. Could be a latent magma chamber reactivating. Or something we haven't seen before, she replied. Either way, we need to move the hydroponics chamber. Sitting right over a new plume. The relocation took 4 days. They dismantled the trays, rerouted the nutrient lines, and built a new grow platform atop reinforced anchors. The crops survived. Barely. The kelp showed signs of thermal stress, but Oriana adjusted the light cycles and the plants began to recover. Solen returned on the evening of day 90. It didn't enter this time. Instead, it stood in silence just outside the perimeter, facing the wind. Wenton walked out alone, pulling his coat tighter around his neck. Snow curled in spirals at their feet. You've seen the convective patterns now, Solen said without turning. The ice is not as dead as you believed. We're adapting to it, said Wenton. We've already relocated the systems at risk. Solen's skin darkened slightly, a ripple of cobalt across its shoulders. You don't understand. This is not a cycle. It's an emergence. Of what? There are things in the deeper strata. Thermogenic structures. Organic but not alive as you define it. We've recorded them before. They rise when the crust thins. Wenton folded his arms. You're telling me there's something down there waking up? They do not wake. They unfold. Inside, Oriana was recalibrating the seismic monitors when Wenton returned. He relayed Solen's warning. Unfolding structures? She repeated. What does that even mean? I don't know, Wenton said. But we're not waiting to find out. Reinforce every anchor point in the lower sections. Add vibrational dampeners to the living quarters. If the ground shifts again, I want us riding it, not breaking apart. 2 days later, at precisely 0400, the deep frequency sensors registered a harmonic pulse from beneath the ridge. It lasted 7 seconds and caused every steel beam in the habitat to hum faintly. No damage. No aftershocks. Just an eerie resonance that rattled teeth and made Morgan vomit in her bunk. Whatever it is, she groaned, wiping her mouth with a towel, it's got a sense of theater. Oriana isolated the wave pattern. It's not tectonic. It's modulated. Repeating intervals. Like sonar. Or a signal. By day 95, the pulses had stopped. But the ice around the ridge had begun to shift subtly. No more quakes, but the air had grown warmer, just enough to cause condensation on the interior windows. We're in a pressure bubble, said Ralvin, adjusting the ventilation flow. The glacier's insulating us more than it should. If we don't vent the excess heat, we're going to see mold blooms in the ductwork. They installed auxiliary vents and flushed the system every 6 hours. The air cleared, but the condensation returned each night, as if something deep beneath was exhaling. On the morning of day 100, Solen entered without a word and placed a crystalline object on the table, smooth, translucent, and faintly glowing. Pulsed once, then went dark. That's a resonator, Solen said. It will respond when the structures below move again. If it turns red, evacuate. Wenton studied it. What happens if it stays dark? Then you've earned your shelter. 3 days passed. The resonator remained inert. The team resumed operations. They excavated new mineral veins, expanded the greenhouse by 15 square meters, and completed the first alloy castings from the vanadium ore. Morgan built a sled rig she called the Ice Mule, a remote hauler that could transport up to 200 kilograms across unstable terrain. She demonstrated it by loading it with scrap and sending it over a fracture line at 15 kilometers per hour. It bounced twice, corrected, and kept going. Now we don't have to break our backs hauling rocks, she said. Progress. By day 112, the ice had stopped shifting. The temperature stabilized. The resonator remained dark. Wenton woke that morning to silence, not the mechanical hum of life support silence, but a complete absence of external sound. No wind, no creaks, nothing. He stepped outside and looked up. The sky was clear. Oriana joined him minutes later, holding a scanner. Everything's flatlined. No seismic activity. No air pressure fluctuation. It's like the planet's holding its breath. Solen arrived at midday. They are gone, it said. Wenton narrowed his eyes. The structures. They receded, subducted into the deeper ice. The resonator would have warned of emergence. It activated while you slept. Briefly. Then it extinguished. Why didn't anyone hear it? It doesn't use sound. It uses presence. You would not have known unless you were attuned. Morgan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. So, we passed their test. They have no interest in tests. You simply weren't worth consuming. Wenton raised an eyebrow. That's comforting. It should be, said Solen. You built something resilient enough to be ignored. Later that evening, the team gathered in the common room. The habitat was warm. The walls no longer creaked with thermal strain. The hydroponics chamber glowed with steady green light. Oriana held up a flask of distilled water. To the only crew dumb enough to colonize the inside of a glacier. Morgan clinked hers against it. And smart enough to make it work. Wenton looked around the table. No one was injured. No systems were failing. Even the Ice Mule had returned from a solo run with its cargo intact. We're done here, he said at last. Oriana blinked. What do you mean? We've proven it can be done. We've mapped the terrain, built sustainable systems, survived environmental anomalies, and resisted whatever was under the ice. There's nothing left to prove. Morgan exhaled. So, we leave? We leave, Wenton said. We log the data, pack the core systems, and hand it over to the next team. Let them build the city. We were never meant to stay. Solen stood outside the perimeter again as they disassembled the habitat. It watched without comment as beams were stacked, vents resealed, and consoles powered down. As the lander ignited, Wenton looked down at the ridge one last time. The snow had already begun to reclaim the footprints. Solen took a slow step forward. You are not what we expected. Wenton nodded. We rarely are.